The screech of tires ripped through the late afternoon quiet, a violent sound that echoed off the brick buildings lining Willow Creek Road. A glossy black sedan, polished to a mirror sheen that reflected the fiery hues of the setting sun, shuddered to a halt, angled sharply against the curb. A beat of silence hung in the air, thick with unspoken tension, before a police cruiser, lights flashing red and blue even in the fading daylight, pulled in tight behind it, effectively boxing it in. Was it merely a routine traffic stop gone slightly aggressive in its execution? Or was something more insidious at play in this sudden, jarring interruption of the ordinary evening flow? Officer Miller, his badge glinting harshly under the flashing lights, emerged from the cruiser. He was a man built solid, with a square jaw perpetually set in a hard line, and eyes that seemed to scan the world with a mixture of suspicion and entitlement. He carried himself with the swagger of someone used to unquestioned authority, someone who viewed the world in stark divisions of us and them, and he made no attempt to soften the aggressive set of his shoulders as he approached the black sedan. The driver's side window of the sedan hummed as it lowered, revealing a black woman in her late 50s, her features composed, her gaze steady and intelligent behind stylish, thin-rimmed glasses. There was an air of quiet dignity about her, a subtle strength that emanated even in this unsettling encounter. "License and registration," Miller barked, his tone clipped and devoid of common courtesy. No good evening, no polite explanation for the stop, just a demand, issued as if to a subordinate, not a fellow citizen. Justice Walker, for it was she, though Officer Miller remained blissfully ignorant of that fact, met his gaze evenly. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried as she reached into her glove compartment, retrieved the requested documents, and extended them towards him. Miller snatched the license and registration from her outstretched hand, his fingers brushing hers with dismissive indifference. He barely glanced at the papers before fixing his gaze back on her, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Know why I pulled you over, ma'am?" he drawled, the ma'am laced with sarcasm, rendering it more of an insult than a courtesy. "I believe you indicated speeding, officer," Justice Walker replied, her voice calm, measured, betraying none of the unease the sudden stop must have caused. Miller chuckled, a short, unpleasant sound. "Speeding is just the start. Let's be real here. This isn't exactly your neighborhood, is it? And this car—" He gestured around the luxurious interior with a sweep of his hand, his eyes lingering on the fine leather and polished wood trim. "This is a bit much for around here, wouldn't you say?" His words hung in the air, thick with unspoken assumptions, dripping with prejudice. He didn't explicitly state his racist insinuations, but they were as palpable as the exhaust fumes from his cruiser. Justice Walker's expression remained unchanged, a mask of composed neutrality. "I am within my rights to drive on any public road, officer," she stated, her voice even, devoid of defensiveness or anger, yet carrying an undercurrent of steel. "And the car is legally registered and insured." "Legal, maybe?" Miller leaned closer, his face inches from hers, invading her personal space. "But is it legitimate? Someone like you, driving a car like this, in this part of town?" He let the question hang, heavy with implication. He was implying she didn't belong, that her very presence in this neighborhood, in this car, was inherently suspicious because of her race. He stepped back, finally, and began to examine her license and registration with exaggerated slowness, flipping them over and back as if searching for some hidden flaw, some manufactured justification for his unwarranted stop. He ran a finger down her driver's license, pausing at her name. Sarah Walker. He repeated it slowly, deliberately, as if trying to extract some hidden meaning from the simple syllables. "Sarah Walker," he murmured, looking back up at her, his eyes narrowed. Well, Ms. Walker, everything seems to be in order on paper. He paused, letting the unspoken doubt linger. But something still doesn't quite add up here. Justice Walker maintained her composure, her steady gaze fixed on Officer Miller's face. Within the quiet depths of her eyes, however, a flicker of something else began to emerge, not fear, not anger, but a profound disappointment, a weariness born of countless such encounters, mixed with a steely resolve. She was observing him, yes, but she was also assessing, evaluating, and silently making a decision. Officer Miller, blinded by his own prejudice and puffed up by his perceived authority, was oblivious to the silent judgment being passed upon him. He strutted back to his cruiser, papers in hand, a smug satisfaction radiating from his posture. He believed he had put this uppity black woman in her place, reminded her of the unspoken boundaries he believed existed. He had no idea that with each prejudiced word, each condescending gesture, he was digging himself deeper into a hole he couldn't even begin to fathom. As Officer Miller disappeared into his cruiser, presumably to run her information, Justice Walker remained perfectly still, her hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. The setting sun cast long shadows, stretching and distorting the scene, painting Willow Creek Road in hues of deepening twilight and gathering shadows. The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered and ominous. What would Justice Sarah Walker do now? And just who, exactly, was Officer Miller dealing with? The imposing mahogany door of Justice Sarah Walker's Supreme Court chambers closed with a soft, weighty thud, shutting out the hushed reverence of the courthouse hallway and enveloping her in a space that was both sanctuary and command center. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the room's rich textures. The deep crimson of the velvet drapes, the gleam of polished wood, the towering shelves lined with leather-bound volumes that whispered of centuries of legal precedent. It was a world removed, seemingly impossibly distant, from the harsh glare of the street and the crude arrogance of Officer Miller just moments before. What happens, indeed, when the scales of justice themselves are tipped, however subtly, by the very forces they are meant to weigh and balance? What course of action does a Supreme Court justice take when confronted not in the abstract realm of legal theory, but in the raw, personal sting of racial prejudice? Justice Walker moved with a measured grace to her desk, the weight of her robes a silent reminder of the immense responsibility she carried. She did not explode in anger, did not succumb to the immediate heat of indignation that simmered beneath her composed exterior. Instead, she allowed the initial shock of the encounter to recede, replaced by a cold, analytical assessment of what had transpired. It wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others, unseen, unheard, who faced similar, perhaps even harsher, encounters every day. It was about the insidious undercurrent of racism that still pulsed within the veins of the very system she had dedicated her life to upholding. The personal insult faded into the background, eclipsed by a larger, more profound concern. The erosion of trust, the insidious seep of injustice that could poison the wellspring of equality. With a sigh that was barely audible, Justice Walker reached for her secure phone line, a direct connection to a select few she trusted implicitly. She dialed a number, waited a moment, and then spoke, her voice low and steady, devoid of emotion yet carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "David? Sarah here. I need to speak with you confidentially." Justice Walker paused, listening to the reply on the other end. "Yes, it's about an incident, one that concerns police conduct and potentially broader issues within the department." She recounted the traffic stop, detail by precise detail, omitting no nuance of Officer Miller's behavior, no subtle inflection of his prejudiced tone. She spoke not with outrage, but with the dispassionate precision of a lawyer presenting evidence, letting the facts speak for themselves. David, her trusted colleague, a former prosecutor now holding a high-ranking position within the Justice Department, listened in silence. When Justice Walker finished, a low, thoughtful hum resonated from the phone. "I understand, Sarah," he said, his voice grave. "This is deeply troubling. And coming from you, I know this is not hyperbole. You want an inquiry. Not just an inquiry, David. A review. Comprehensive, discreet, and focused. I want to know if this is an isolated incident or a symptom of something deeper. I want to know about Officer Miller, his record, his training, and I want to understand the prevailing culture within his precinct, within the department as a whole regarding racial bias." And so, the wheels began to turn, silently, invisibly. Justice Walker, using her vast network and considerable influence, initiated a quiet, internal investigation. No public pronouncements, no sensational headlines, just the steady, inexorable pursuit of truth, guided by the unwavering compass of justice. Meanwhile, miles away, Officer Miller patrolled his assigned streets, a self-satisfied smirk plastered on his face. He recounted the traffic stop to his fellow officers in the precinct break room, exaggerating his own bravado, embellishing the woman's supposed entitlement, drawing laughter and nods of approval from some, uneasy silence from others. "You should have seen her car, boys," Miller chuckled, leaning back in his chair, legs spread wide in a display of machismo. "Black woman, driving a German luxury sedan? You know how it is. Probably stolen, drug money, who knows. But she got the message." Officer Miller set her straight. He basked in the fleeting glow of their reactions, oblivious to the gathering storm clouds, utterly unaware that the woman he had so casually demeaned was not just another citizen, but a justice of the Supreme Court, and that his actions were already setting in motion a chain of events that would soon shatter his complacent world. As the internal investigation deepened, a disquieting pattern began to emerge. Officer Miller's file, when scrutinized with a newly critical eye, revealed a history of complaints, whispers of racially biased behavior, incidents brushed aside, warnings unheeded. Minor infractions, perhaps, viewed in isolation. But when pieced together, they painted a disturbing picture of a man whose prejudice was not just a personal failing, but a pattern of conduct tolerated, even implicitly condoned by the system itself. The evidence mounted, each piece clicking into place with chilling precision. Witness statements, internal memos, overlooked incident reports, all converged to point not just at Officer Miller's individual actions, but at a systemic issue that demanded to be addressed. In her chambers, Justice Walker reviewed the preliminary findings, her expression hardening with each page turned. The disappointment she had felt on Willow Creek Road solidified into a firm resolve. This was no longer just about Officer Miller. It was about something far larger, far more crucial. It was time to act. But how would she wield her power? What precise steps would she take to ensure accountability, not just for one officer, but for a system that seemed to harbor, however tacitly, the very biases it was sworn to overcome? And would Officer Miller, still lost in his bubble of arrogant ignorance, ever truly understand the reckoning that was about to descend upon him? Officer Miller strode confidently into the Internal Affairs office, a cocky grin plastered on his face. Summoned for a routine procedural review, he anticipated a minor inconvenience, perhaps a slap on the wrist at most. He was certain he had acted within his rights, had taught that woman a lesson, and expected to be commended, not questioned. The sterile, impersonal office, with its closed blinds and air of hushed intensity, did little to dampen his self-assurance. Was this just another bureaucratic formality? Or was Officer Miller finally about to face the consequences of his actions, consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined. He was directed to a chair facing a long table, behind which sat two figures in somber suits, internal affairs investigators, their expressions unreadable. The lead investigator, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, began the questioning, her voice crisp and professional. "Officer Miller, we are conducting a review regarding a traffic stop on Willow Creek Road yesterday evening. Can you describe the events as you recall them?" Miller launched into his rehearsed narrative, portraying himself as the diligent officer, the woman as uncooperative and entitled, subtly emphasizing her race and the luxury car as contributing factors to his reasonable suspicion. He omitted his condescending remarks, downplayed his aggressive tone, and presented a sanitized, self-serving version of the encounter. The investigators listened patiently, their faces betraying nothing. When Miller finished, the lead investigator simply nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Thank you, Officer Miller. Now, let's examine the evidence." And then the tide began to turn. They presented witness statements, and not just from Justice Walker, whose name was still deliberately withheld, but from residents of Willow Creek Road who had observed the traffic stop and were disturbed by Officer Miller's demeanor. They showed printouts of his past disciplinary record, highlighting previous complaints of racial bias, incidents that had been quietly buried or minimized by his superiors. But the most damning piece of evidence was yet to come. With a click of a remote, a large screen on the wall flickered to life, displaying a clear, unedited video recording of the entire traffic stop. Whether it was from a dashcam, a nearby security camera, or some other source, it captured everything. Officer Miller's aggressive approach, his condescending language, his blatant disrespect, and Justice Walker's unwavering composure in the face of his unwarranted hostility. On screen, Officer Miller watched himself, his smug expression slowly dissolving into a mask of dawning horror. The video was irrefutable, his carefully constructed narrative crumbling into dust before his own eyes. He stammered, attempted weak denials, tried to deflect blame, but the evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. Just as he was floundering, grasping for excuses, the door to the office opened. Officer Miller froze, his blood turning to ice. Standing in the doorway, framed by the light of the hallway, was Justice Sarah Walker. But this was not the composed, subtly dignified woman from Willow Creek Road. This was Justice Sarah Walker of the Supreme Court of the United States, resplendent in her judicial robes, an aura of power and authority radiating from her very presence. The investigators rose respectfully as she entered, their demeanor shifting to one of deference and gravity. Officer Miller remained seated, paralyzed, his mouth agape, his eyes wide with disbelief and terror. The color drained from his face as the full weight of his actions crashed down upon him. He had not just been rude to a citizen. He had accosted, demeaned, and insulted a justice of the highest court in the land, fueled by nothing but his own poisonous prejudice. Justice Walker moved to stand at the head of the table, her gaze sweeping over Officer Miller, her expression a mixture of profound disappointment and quiet resolve. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice clear and resonant, filling the room with quiet authority. "Do you recognize me?" Miller could only nod mutely, his bravado completely extinguished, replaced by a crushing wave of shame and fear. "Yesterday evening," Justice Walker continued, her voice steady and devoid of anger, yet laced with steel, "you stopped me on Willow Creek Road. You treated me with disrespect. You made assumptions about me based on my race and the car I was driving, and you abused your authority as a police officer." She paused, letting her words sink in. "This is not about personal offense, Officer Miller. This is about the integrity of the justice system you are sworn to uphold." It is about the trust that must exist between law enforcement and the communities they serve. And it is about the corrosive impact of racial bias on that trust, and on the very fabric of our society. A choked sound escaped Miller's lips. Justice. Justice Walker. I didn't know. His apology was pathetic, self-serving, motivated by fear of consequences, not genuine remorse. Justice Walker cut him off with a dismissive wave of her hand. Your lack of awareness is precisely the problem, Officer Miller. It is the blind spot of prejudice that allows such behavior to persist, to fester, and to erode the foundations of justice. She turned to the investigators. I trust you will take appropriate disciplinary action based on the evidence presented, and I expect a full and transparent review of this department's policies and training regarding racial profiling and police conduct. Her gaze returned to Officer Miller, cold and unwavering. This incident, Officer Miller, will not be swept under the rug. It will serve as a catalyst for change. A change that is long overdue. In the aftermath, the wheels of justice turned swiftly and decisively. Officer Miller was suspended without pay, pending a full disciplinary hearing. The video of the traffic stop leaked to the press, sparking outrage and national debate about racial profiling and police accountability. Officer Miller became a pariah, his career and reputation irrevocably ruined, a stark example of the price of prejudice and abuse of power. Justice Walker, in a public statement, addressed the incident, not with vindictive triumph, but with a measured call for systemic reform. She emphasized the importance of holding law enforcement accountable, of confronting racial bias head-on, and of building a truly just and equitable society for all. The story of the traffic stop on Willow Creek Road became more than just an isolated incident. It became a symbol, a turning point, a stark reminder that no one, regardless of their position or privilege, is above the law, and that the pursuit of justice demands constant vigilance, unwavering courage, and a commitment to confronting uncomfortable truths, even within the very institutions sworn to uphold it. The scales of justice, though momentarily tilted, had been righted, not by vengeance, but by the quiet, unwavering power of truth and the resolute pursuit of equality.